Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they? Isn't that so?
You tried to get into the locked drawer today, didn't you?
How do the dead come back, Mother? What's the secret?
Back Along the Old Track by Sam Hicks. It's funny, but I can't remember how the game ended, or if it ended at all. But I do remember that I had just set my last but one domino on the old wooden counter, and that Tom Ranscombe was chuckling softly as he looked at the piece he held shielded in his hand. I don't remember if he was amused by victory or defeat, because then someone said, "There they all go," and in such comically doom-laden tones that I turned from our game to see what was meant. Outside the deep bay windows of the old King's Inn, a hearse was rolling past. It was moving at little above walking pace, slow enough to accommodate the black-clad mourners following on foot. A dense tumble of greenery, mainly ivy, I think, was heaped over the coffin, piled so high that a great deal had spilled into the cavity around, snaking up the windows as if it were growing still. 10 people followed the car, amongst them 2 small children, heads bowed and hands clasped tightly, prayer-like in front. There was a stir of interest in the public bar, and some whispered comments that I couldn't quite catch. "Whose funeral?" I asked Tom. "That'll be old John Sleater's." He leaned on the counter with his arms straight and the fingers of his big hands spread, watching the procession with narrowed eyes. "About time too, some would say." Tom was the landlord of the pub of the holiday cottage I was renting, and a man whose words you listened to. He was intelligent, well-read, and possessed an air of calm sagacity, born, I like to think, of a lifetime study of the human dramas played out in his domain. So, although I was surprised to hear him make such an unkind comment, I was prepared to believe it wasn't lightly said. He continued, "They'll be in here later for the wake in the back room. Sleaters have always held their wakes at the Old King's." "How long's always?" I asked. "This pub's been here since 1453, and so have the Sleater family, though they were here even before then. That's how long always is, young man. Now, do you need another drink, because I'd better get those sandwiches laid out? Best pack the dominoes away, don't want them catching us engaged in madcap frolic." I ordered another beer. I had been meaning to leave after our game, but now I wanted to stay and take a look at the Sleaters. After 10 minutes or so, Tom reappeared and said to me, "Now, when they come in, make sure you don't catch any of their eyes." "Right. Are they really that bad?" "Not always, but I'd advise caution where Sleaters are concerned, just in case. Everyone in here knows about them, but you, being a visitor, don't." One of the old men playing cards at a corner table and clearly not hard of hearing spoke up. "You'll do well to listen to Tom, young'un. I still got some lively scars from the day I looked at a Sleater wrong. Here, you know you can see their farm across the field at the back of your cottage." "That place? That's theirs?" "Oh yes," Tom said. "Lucky for you there's a field in between. You're out of harm's way, don't worry." "Is it their field?" "Oh yes, but you've seen it. They don't pay it much mind. Mainly they raise goats and brew cider from their orchard. We sell it here, the cider. People come from miles around to drink Sleater special." "Knock your socks off that, Will," said a grizzled man sitting on his own near the door. "And you know all about that, Arthur," said Tom. The public bar of the Old King's Inn was small, making a private conversation difficult when, as on that day, so few people were there. I wanted to question Tom further about this notorious family, but was held back by the thought of being overheard. Had it been the weekend, which was when I'd first arrived, it would have been a different matter. Then the pub would be packed with people from surrounding towns, come to enjoy its unchanging rustic charms. The low-beamed ceilings, the thick, cave-like walls, open stone fireplaces, and the barrels of beer stacked up behind the bar. Then even the back room would be lively with shouts and laughter, and the Sleaters and their funeral gloom would be far from anyone's mind. As Tom said, I was a visitor, yet even an outsider could sense the tension growing in the room. No one left, and little was said. Tom took to wiping things down behind the counter, and quite unnecessarily, I suspected, to counting the takings in the till, filling small bags with coppers and silvers, and replacing them in the drawer with an impatient sigh. Then a blast of March air put an end to the vigil as the door swung open so abruptly that had bounced off the frame with a splintering crack. Tom winced. "Everything's ready," he said. "Just go through." I didn't turn my head after the warning I'd received, but I watched the party as they trooped past the end of the counter, through the low door and into the crooked passage that led to the back room. There was no missing the family resemblance in the 3 generations, although it was split between 2 types. The 3 younger men, one of the older men, and a woman I placed in her late 60s, represented one branch of the clan. They had heavy, prominent simian jaws which didn't quite fit with the high, narrow foreheads and small, sunken eyes above. The older man and the 2 younger women had flat, mask-like faces, with squashed noses and thick-lidded, watery eyes. The children, perhaps aged 5 or 6, had these same liquid eyes and already a marked thickening around their chins. An unpleasant thought occurred to me, and when they were all safely out of hearing, I said to Tom in an undertone, "Close-knit lot, are they?" Tom raised an eyebrow and leaned across the counter. "So you noticed that, eh? Sleaters marry Burchards, and Burchards marry Sleaters, and if your cousin is your 3rd or your 2nd or your 1st or even your half-sister, well, who's counting? The little ones haven't become one or the other yet, but they always do. They don't combine, you see. One side always gets the upper hand and then the face comes out. The Sleaters have that Cro-Magnon look, and the Burchards look like fish. Oh yes, you'll see it all out here. And you thought all the excitement was to be had in the city." For all Tom's counsel, a few minutes later, I did just the thing he had warned me not to. Before leaving, I needed to pay a visit to the gents, which was situated perilously close to the back room, just off the connecting passageway. When I emerged from that tomb-like chamber, I simply couldn't resist a glance through the open door. Emotions were clearly running high. One of the older men, he with the Sleater looks, had pulled one of the younger male Sleaters towards him by the lapels of his funeral jacket, and was shouting in his befuddled face, "You should know what to do by now, you mangy idiot! You're less use than a turd! I'll have to take care of it myself then, won't I?" The rest of the party looked on, not shocked by the man's behaviour, but rather approving of it seemed to me. The senior Sleater tossed the younger one aside, sending him crashing into the table where Tom had set up plates of sandwiches and bottles of cider and beer. Then, swearing loudly, he pushed his way out of the room, only to meet the eye of the puny stranger cowering just beyond the threshold. If it weren't for his obvious distraction, I'm certain he would have punched me in the face there and then, but as it was, he shoved past me, uttering something like a growl. I was shaking when I returned to the bar. "You just met Jacob Sleater, didn't you?" said Tom when he saw me. "Cheer up, you're still alive." I took the scenic route back to the cottage over a field and through Lark Woods, the box of dry food that Tom had given me for Sanderson rattling in my bag as I went. Sanderson was a big bruiser of a ginger cat who lived in the woodshed behind the house. Tom Ranscombe fed and cared for Sanderson, a stray, but had utterly failed to persuade him to move into his flat on the 1st floor of the Old King's Inn. Sanderson preferred his independence and his bed in an orange crate full of rags and wadding to life as a bachelor's companion. Tom said he hoped Sanderson might change his mind when he got to be an elderly cat, that he might see the wisdom of pooling resources, but that for now he was resistant to logic. As soon as I was back, I filled Sanderson's enamel bowl with the food and called for him. But then I spotted him over near the dustbin by the kitchen door. He was hunkered down, patting lazily at some small creature in the grass, so completely possessed by that feline mix of playfulness and cruelty that he was oblivious to my presence. I shouted at him and advanced, hoping to rescue the bird or mouse from a slow death by torture. Sanderson looked up, amazed to see me there, and scooted away through the hedge into what I now knew to be the Sleater's field. I squatted down to assess the condition of his prey, then leapt straight back up with a yelp. Armed with a stout twig, I approached again. It wasn't easy to say what it was. It was as white as squid, with the same slimy gloss, but as thick and muscular as a steak. The shape I can only compare to a hugely magnified wheatberry, pointed at the ends and fatter in the centre, slightly convex at its widest point. It lay, oozing a thin grey liquid that shimmered as it leaked into the grass. Perhaps Sanderson had got his claws on the afterbirth of some farm animal, I thought. I prodded it with the twig, then lifted it toward the dustbin. As I dropped it, it twitched. Retching a bit, I banged down the lid and wiped my hands on my trousers, even though I had not actually touched the thing. I had by then cancelled my plans to drive into the nearest town for dinner that night. It struck me as far too much effort, and I was instead looking forward to a cosy night basking in the warmth of the cast-iron wood burner, some soup and bread, maybe a glass or two of wine, and bed before 10. That, after all, was the idea of staying here. I'd intended walks on the high Weald, early nights, wholesome food, peace and quiet. I could just as easily have had a couple of weeks in Italy or Greece or France instead of the safe option of rural Kent. But I felt tired, just thinking about airports and taxis and museum crowds and hire cars and other languages and trudging along endless, dusty, incomprehensible streets. I needed, at that particular time, familiarity, smugness, ease. I'd been working too hard for too long, and after one incident too many of losing my temper with someone I shouldn't have, I finally took my head of department's advice to have some time away. A friend of mine recommended the cottage in the hamlet of Mardham. She'd stayed there one Christmas. It was bliss, she said. One pub, one church, one shop, houses that really looked like gingerbread, and everyone was so nice. As dusk fell, it started to rain. I hoped Sanderson had recovered from the shock I'd given him and returned to the shelter of his little nest in the shed. I looked out the kitchen window as I stirred the soup on the hob, checking for signs of him. At the end of the strip of lawn, the high blackthorn hedge, still winter bare, for it had been a cold, late spring, revealed scraps of the field beyond. Where the ground rose in the distance, I could see the ramshackle metal barn, randomly patched with bits of wood. Behind it was the buckled roof of the house, a narrow ribbon of smoke rising from one of its 4 chimneys. Tom Ranscombe was right about the field. The Sleaters didn't appear to pay it much mind. Earlier in the week I'd balanced on an upturned bucket to look over the hedge, curious to see if a crop was growing there, but was left none the wiser. Nothing there but a collection of diseased grey seed heads rising from collapsed rosettes of leaves, patches of thistle and rough weed, claggy earth and stones. The fading light and the rain lent a greyness to everything that evening, a dreary, sodden aspect that made me glad to be indoors. The radio burbled from the mantelpiece, and the simmering soup, bought from a city deli, smelt good. Then I saw something, walking past the hedge in the Sleater's field. The parts that were visible through the twisted thorn darkened, then lightened, then darkened again. I was sure it was a person. The person had to be a Sleater. With the unruffled movements of someone unaware they're being watched, I carried the soup pan to the table and then returned to the window, pulling the chintz curtains shut in a casual, everyday way. If they couldn't see me, I couldn't see them. But I couldn't let it go. For the rest of the evening, I was as jittery as a rabbit who knows a fox has caught its scent. I forensically analysed any unexpected sound, turned the radio down at every creak and crack of old timber and brick, and checked that the doors were locked again and again, in case I'd been mistaken the last time. I pictured the Sleater lurking outside, waiting for me to emerge so he could inflict lively scars upon me, as had happened to the man in the pub. I had, after all, caught Jacob Sleater's eye. Perhaps he would come for revenge, and I could only guess at what he might think suitable. In the end, the wine and the warmth of the sitting room stupefied me sufficiently for sleep, and I tottered up the narrow stairs to the bedroom I had made my own. I went to draw the curtains and paused when I noticed that the rain had stopped and a perfect full moon was shining, dazzling, over the Sleater's field. And there, at the brow of the hill, I saw a hunched figure with a coil of thick rope slung around his upper body, labouring, head down, towards the barn. He passed into the shadow of some trees and was gone. I rose late the next morning and had a proper fried breakfast, washed down with several cups of strong coffee, and seeing as it was a cheerful blue-skied day, set off for a walk along the river and past the old mill ponds that were dotted around the outskirts of the village. I checked the sheds before I left, but there was no sign of Sanderson, and his food looked untouched. But I was pretty sure that there was no cause for alarm with a cat like that. I laughed at the state I'd got myself into the night before. For God's sake, I told myself, you live in a city where you take your life in your hands every time you walk home at night. And here, you get jumpy at a shadow behind a hedge. It was, after all, only extraordinary circumstances that had led me to know of the Sleaters' existence, and, in all likelihood, I wouldn't see them again before I went home. It was possible, I'd been told, to walk in a circle from my cottage, through meadows and small orchards and scraps of copse, whilst never leaving the banks of some watercourse or another. The area had once been home to several watermills and a leather-dyeing industry, remembered in names like Tanner's Lane and Mill Road, and the first stream I was to follow, the Mill Leat. I found this stretch of water sheeny, leaf-clogged, barely moving at the edge of a meadow that was halfway turned to liquid mud. A comparatively dry footbridge at the far corner took me over a white, swirling weir, and then I was on the bank of the little river Chase, whose maundering, sedimented course I followed for the next mile or so. The path then cut away from the bank through sharp hawthorn thickets, past scatterings of leafless apple trees, and on to skirt round pastures, whispering with the bubbling, licking sounds of watery earth. I passed a series of ponds covered in floating islands of broken reeds, a collapsed and abandoned tractor trailer, a pile of man-sized concrete pipes, moss-grown and forgotten in a field, and then I was again by the river, crossing a rusty metal bridge back in the direction of the village. My hope had been that a walk would lift my spirits, but in fact it seemed to have left me feeling a bit demoralised, perhaps due to the effects of the sludge underfoot and the sluggish, despondent look of the landscape in those few square miles. Even the willow branches overhanging the river held snags of decaying vegetation, circling in the breeze like corpses of tattered birds. Knowing that the final section of any walk always seems the longest, I increased my pace, which wasn't easy with boots plastered with wads of grass and mud. Then I came to a sudden stop. A deep masculine shout rang out, as clear as a cannon, from somewhere back the way I came. But it was more of a bellow than a shout, aggressive, full of guttural threat, the kind deployed to scare a savage animal away. Nightmare images of violent pursuit sprang panting into my mind, bloody wounds and matted fur, yellow teeth bared in gruesome, slavering mouths. I pictured the crazed dread of the animal as it tore through the spiked thickets, headlong, dangerous like the man giving chase, prey and predator, deadly to anything which crossed their paths. Having turned myself light-headed with fear, I broke into something near a jog, and didn't dare slow for the last half mile, not until the path turned back to the lane where my cottage was. My breath was still ragged when I walked into the back garden and saw, framed in the open door of the shed, the goblin form of a Sleater child. I recognised it as the larger of the two I had seen in the old King's Inn. My guess was that it was a boy from the cut of the stiff hair, but the features of the child were ambiguous to say the least. He gazed at me listlessly and stretched out a stubby arm. "I was looking," he said. For a moment I was at total loss. What did you do in situations like that? "Is your daddy here?" I ventured. Or mummy? Someone?" I went to the back door and found it locked as I had left it. The child began to sniffle. "I was looking," he whimpered. "Well, that's all right," I said. "Looking's all right. Now, how did you get here? Do Mummy and Daddy know you're here?" He shook his head and pawed his cheeks with his shrimpy fingers. What the hell was I meant to do? Of all the kids that could end up in my woodshed, why this one? One thing I was sure of was that I was not going to be the one to return it to the Sleater farm. Then I thought of Tom. I only had to get the child to Tom. He'd know what to do. "Now, I bet your Mummy and Daddy are looking for you. We'll go and see Tom at the Old King's, you know, where you were yesterday, and then he'll get your Mummy. How about that?" The child nodded, staring at me with a sort of awe. I suppose he was trying to work out what I was, Sleater or Burchard, or something entirely wonderful and new. I got him to follow me to my car, strapped him into the front seat feeling exactly like an abductor, and drove the half-mile to the pub. There was only one punter in the public bar, much to my relief, an ancient, flat-capped fellow lingering over the dregs of his beer. Tom Ranscombe was behind the counter drying a glass, holding it up to the light for smears, humming a merry tune to himself. When he saw me, he put the glass down with care. "Well now, what's all this?" he said. I went up to the bar and slid onto one of the high stools. "Tom, I've just found the sleater child in my woodshed. He's outside in my car. I don't know what to do." Tom scratched his head and blew through his teeth. "Now, let's see. Take him back?" I know, but what with them being a bit hostile?" "You wondered if I might do it instead?" "Well, I thought it might be better, but you could phone them, couldn't you? They could come and get him." Thing is, they don't have a phone. Barely got electricity. And the thing is, they'll know you found him soon enough and they'll wonder why you didn't take him back yourself. And we don't want Sleaters set all a wonder. So, what I suggest is to come with you and then we'll return the errant child together. How about that? Just give me a minute to lock up." I'd rather hope not to involve myself at all, but I deferred to Tom's judgment. I wasn't in the least surprised that there was a handmade "Keep Out" sign at the start of the potholed drive that led to the Sleater place. The drive branched off a narrow lane that ran past the tiny medieval church and graveyard. I'd already walked the lane and discovered that soon after the church it became unsurfaced track through apple orchards, narrowing to a dirt path that led up Mardham Hill. The child sat quietly in the back seat as I drove, sniffing every now and then. I thought he was probably enjoying his little adventure. "You better wait here," Tom said when we pulled up in the yard in the front of the house. "I'll see if anyone's about." I nodded assent as I looked at the smashed windows on the ground floor of the dirt-coloured buildings, the door swinging on one hinge, the bits of clothing and pots and pans and glass strewn around the muddy concrete yard. "Christ," I said, "what the hell's been going on here?" "Sleater's been going on here," Tom replied. I watched him go up to the house and call out. When no answer came, he walked round the side, probably to check the barn. I didn't like him being out of sight. What if they turned up now, with me and their child in the back of the car? The yard was situated behind the miserable field that backed onto my cottage, and through a gap in the trees, stricken, wind-sheared things, I could see the upper floor and the humped clay tiles of the roof. I sat forward in my seat. Through the gaps of the hedge I could see something white, moving slowly, in a way that even from there was suggestive of a living thing. A big hand thumped onto my near-side window and the door behind me clicked. It was Tom. Across the yard, hovering at the side of the barn, was the Sleater matriarch. Her arms crossed over her old khaki sweater, her face set in an inexplicable expression of defiance. "Come on, little 'un," Tom said, helping the child from the back seat. "Grandma's waiting for you." The boy hopped out and scampered over to the woman, who made no move to hug him or even ruffle his hair. Instead, she kept her eyes on Tom and me as I started the engine and reversed the car out of the yard. "Well?" I asked him as we jolted back up the track. "Why was the house all smashed up? And had they even noticed the kid was gone?" Tom shook his head wearily. "What can I tell you? I asked her if there'd been any trouble, and do you know what she says? Ha! She tells me a goat got out the top field and went a bit mad. That's where the rest of them are, she says, putting the mad goat back in the field. Little Adam must have wandered off in all the fuss, she says. A goat? A goat that rips doors off and needs a whole gang of Sleaters to restrain it?" He looked at me and sighed. What can I say? I'd like to say it'd be nice for them to do something normal for a change, but I suppose the shock would kill me if they did. Now, how about a whiskey in the pub before you head back? On the house. I said I would pass on the offer, but agreed to go to the old King's Inn that evening. Tom promised me free beer to make up for all this fuss. Back at the cottage, I inspected the garden for evidence of an animal having been there, particularly a white one, but there was nothing I could see, not even Sanderson. I reminded myself to let Tom know that the cat had made himself scarce. Perhaps someone in the village had seen him. Perhaps he'd moved in somewhere else. But maybe he was sick. Perhaps that stuff he'd got hold of didn't agree with him. I cautiously lifted the dustbin lid to have another look at it, but either it had sunk down into the rest of the rubbish, or it had dried up into the shriveled black curl of stuff that lay on top of yesterday's papers. I ended up passing a pleasant evening in the old King's. I got roped into game after game of euchre, which luckily I'd played a few times before, with 3 of the old boys, and what with a generous supply of beer from Tom, the gruff, sarcastic banter, and the soothing crackle of the log fire, I wandered back to the cottage with the satisfied feeling of a few hours well spent. There had been, however, one moment of awkwardness. although I swept it aside at the time. When I returned from the bar after a pause in play, my three companions cut short a hushed conversation. The last few words sounded like, "One more day," but I wouldn't have dreamed of asking what they meant. I went up to bed relaxed and content, and fell asleep straight away, only to come awake some hours later, horribly, coldly certain that someone was in the house. I lay rigid, listening to a sound which may have been just outside my bedroom door, a prolonged, yawning creak like a slice of floorboard being prized from the frame above. As if sensing I was now fully conscious, the noise stopped. I clenched the blankets, staring into the dark until my awareness of every sound, and then of the mournful, hollow circling of the wind outside, reached such an endurable pitch that I leapt from the bed, smacking the light switch on and slamming the bedroom door to and fro with a cry of, "I can hear you! I can hear you!" Silence answered me, but I detected a change, a lifting of pressure, a new texture, as if what had been there had now gone. I turned the light back off and went to the window, opening the curtains a crack. Out there, in the almost phosphorescent light of the moon, I saw two figures crossing Sleater's Field, and one of them, I'm sure, turned briefly, as if he knew I were there. As I made a late breakfast the next morning, I started to toy with the idea of cutting my holiday short, but then I became annoyed with myself for letting my over-anxious nature get the better of me, for giving way to the imagined rather than the actual, as was my habitual wont. So I came to a compromise with myself. I'd give it one more day, and if I still couldn't find it in me to relax, I'd admit defeat. I knew I couldn't expect a refund for the remaining days, nor would I ask, but if I was going to spend half the night jumping out of my skin, I would be better off at home. I decided to spend the day further afield, and after another futile search for Sanderson, who Tom assured me often did disappearing acts, I set off for the nearest quaint Kentish town. I visited churches and antique shops. I had tea and cake served to me by girls in black dresses with white aprons. I dawdled in a local history museum. I bought a book on smuggling in the 17th century, and I had dinner in a lovely restaurant with views of a fine church tower. Then I drove back through the unlit country roads in a light-hearted mood, looking forward to a tot or two of the 15-year-old rum I'd bought from a little shop in a honey-coloured market square. I parked the car outside the cottage, but I didn't get out. Instead, I sat listening to the impatient tick of the cooling engine, reluctant to move at all. "Stupid!" I shouted, and I gathered up my bags decisively and went around to the back of the house. But I couldn't shake the unease. I went to the woodshed and fetched the axe that was kept next to the pile of logs. Insurance, I told myself. Who wouldn't sleep easier with an axe under the bed? The back door was unlocked. No need to panic, I thought. No need. Didn't you forget to lock it once last week? Yes, you did. Thought you'd done it, but you hadn't. Putting down my bags, but not the axe, I felt for the light switch inside the door. The bulb flickered and extinguished with a snap, and in the brief moment I saw illuminated as if by lightning the gurning, malevolent features of Jacob Sleater and a Sleater's son, bent over something huge and ghastly white, into whom they were aiming brutal, driving blows. In the dark, the room seemed to drag itself towards me. Everything dropped from height and crashed into the ground, churned and broken, then rose upwards in a furious squall. A mass of flesh smashed into me, crushing me into the wall, surrounding me with choking stench, the smell of dung and airless earth and diseased breath. Then it spun away, barreling through the open door with the others, out into the night. I stumbled in panic to the kitchen, shoved a chair up against the door, and felt my way to the window. Even though what I then witnessed is burnt into my mind, even though I see it again and again in paralyzing, death-like dreams, despite all this, I still question how we can ever know if our memories are truly real. I mean the quivering heave of the wet, white flesh that the Sleaters were battling to restrain, the fluttering of the root-like fingers, the flailing, clotted, swollen arms, and bowed, half-melted legs, the distorted head which juddered through restless attempts at features, a nose that spasmed into the form of an eye, an ear that emptied into a mouth. Jacob Sleater, horribly cut and bruised about the face, had managed to tie some rope around the thing's upper half, and the Sleater son, unflinching, was throwing his own rope over its head. With a united grunting effort, they pulled the ends of rope tight, penning the creature between them, and dragged its spasming body to a newly hacked gash in the hedge, through into the rotten furrows of their moonlit field. Tom was still clearing up in the bar after closing when I banged on the side door, shouting fit to wake the whole village, which I no doubt did. He ushered me to a table near the fire, brought me a double brandy, and told me to slow down, to try to get my words right, to take a deep breath. After listening to my muddled, near-delirious account of what happened at the cottage, he rose from the table to fetch the rest of the brandy and a glass for himself. His eyes were troubled when he sat back down, but his manner was as steady as ever. "Now then, first things first," he said, filling our glasses. "Did you contact the police at all before you came over here? Did you call them?" It was a sensible and practical question. I should have done that, and felt embarrassed to admit I hadn't. "No, I suppose my first thought was to get somewhere I'd be safe, but we can call them now. We should do that right away." I stood up and felt for my phone, but as I pulled it from my pocket, Tom said, "And what will you tell them?" You see, that's why I asked. What would you say to them, or anyone? That the Sleaters were fighting with a monster in your cottage? Is that what you tell them? I couldn't grasp what he was saying and went on the defensive, waving my arms about to press my point home. "But that's what it was like. You didn't see it. You can't imagine what it was like. I don't know what it was. Something sick. Some sick, deformed thing." "A goat?" I gaped at Tom, feeling totally exasperated. Was he making fun of me? Did he think I'd exaggerated what I'd seen? Was his look of concern the sort he wore professionally to soothe hysterics and madmen and drunks? "It wasn't a goat. It really, really wasn't a goat," I said. He drew his chair closer to the fireplace and studied what was left of the logs in the basket grate. Then he turned and spoke. "Let me tell you something," he said. "Around here, we have a saying, 3 days to lay a Sleater to rest. And do you know why? The Sleaters, well, they don't die, right? Never have. They die twice, you see. What's buried in the graveyard behind the church isn't what gets burned to ash and cast upon the ground in their orchard back along the old track. I can't change that, and nor can they. And it's not for me or anyone else to say as we should. We leave them be, and things go on quite well. In a place like this, you make allowances. You have to, or life becomes unbearable, and that's how it is. It's just a shame you happened along when one of them decided to pass, and got you caught up in something you shouldn't have seen. It's a pity, that is. It isn't always like that, but John Sleater was one of the worst of them, and he was bound to go hard." I studied his face, hoping his solemn expression would suddenly break into laughter, willing him to slap his big hand on the table and shout, "Oh, how'd you go in there?" But that didn't happen. He looked entirely, frighteningly serious as he sat waiting for me to speak. "Tom, do you mean it? But how can they die twice? What was that thing? How can they die twice? What was it I saw?" "I can't explain that in any way you'd like to hear, or in any way that would do you any good. So I say it was a goat. A goat got loose. That's what they'd say. And that's what I'd say to anyone that asked. You being a worried sort of bloke, got confused in the dark. When people from the city come down here, that can happen. They're just not used to the dark." And then he poured us another brandy, and we sat, not speaking, watching the end of the fire, ash falling like paper onto the worn stone of the hearth, the last dying forks of the blue-yellow flame.
Everybody dies, don't they? Everybody come back, don't they?
So that was Back Along the Old Track by Samantha Hicks, and it is from an anthology called Fiends in the Furrows. And how I came across... I actually bought that because I was going through my folk horror phase. Excuse me, I'll have a sip of tea. Just to wet my whistle. And I was going through my folk horror phase at the time, and this was an anthology of folk horror stories. Now, it seems to me that folk horror was more of a thing a couple of years ago. So this was when this was done, and it was a big first step because it was the first living author I'd ever interviewed. So I was a bit apprehensive about it, mainly because she wasn't dead. That's always a worry. First of all, I recorded the story, sent it to her, made sure that she liked the way I'd done it, and then we agreed to interview over Zoom, I think it was. Now, the problem was that the audio wasn't very good. When I was looking at putting this up on YouTube, I contacted Sam again and asked for her permission. So she was quite happy for me to put the story up with the links and everything like that, but was a bit shy about having the audio version up. And I think I said I would actually record a new talky bit to discuss the story. So the story is from an anthology called The Fiends From The Furrows by Nosetouch Press. And I see that they recently brought out a second anthology, imaginatively called Fiends From The Furrows 2. And I haven't actually read that yet. So if they want to send me a copy of Fiends From The Furrow 2 to review, I'd be very happy to do that. I was very impressed by a lot of the stories. I decided that I was going to have a second season of Classic Ghost Stories podcast, whereby I would just read living authors and interview them. So it was a slightly different podcast format. As you can see, I've put a few of my living authors up, and some were quite welcoming, but it's true to say a number of them were a bit suspicious. And I suppose these days, if somebody contacts you out of the blue and offers you something for free, you're very suspicious of it. This happens all the time. People want to give me millions of dollars, people from the UN, from Nigeria, from the FBI, all sorts of people. And some of them are dying. Some of them's husbands died. Sometimes it's an official whereby somebody I don't know has died, and this person wants to leave me a lot of money, which is absolutely lovely of them. Unexpected as well. Just imagine if it were true. And then, of course, I do get, just on the outside, young women from Colombia and the Ukraine who have seen my profile and want to marry me. Actually, wanting to marry me is probably the least offensive thing they want to do. So I just block them these days. So you can understand when I contacted a lot of these modern authors out of the blue and said, my name's Tony Walker, I'm from the Classic Ghost Stories podcast, I would love to interview you. They went, no. But Sam didn't. She said yes. And so we get to this story. So you've just heard the story, and it is a horror story, potentially, a weird tale. And a lot of the folk horror, and so the folk horror element is, it's set in the backwoods. Now, this is all very relative because Kent, the Garden of England, is a beautiful county. I used to live in South London, and I would spend time going to Kent, and I have many fond memories of that beautiful county. But it's very easily reached from London. And Sam told me how she decided she wanted to do a folk horror story and got a train out to Kent and wandered round the lanes. And she told me about how it had gone a bit eerie, in that she was walking down this lane on her own and started to get all sorts of forebodings and things. Now, it always makes me smile because I'm basically a country lad, and I've lived in cities, but I mainly spent most of my time in small towns and villages, living in small towns and villages and travelling through the countryside, both in Wales, when I lived in Wales for 15 years or so, and in Cumbria, and travelled all around those two rural areas. So my point about this is somebody from London going into Kent, the idea of being the only person you can see must be really unnerving. You know, imagine walking through the countryside and you don't see another human being when you're used to seeing millions. In fact, you can't get away from them. And then we talked about her influences. It struck me, I'd just done a story by Russell Kirk, who's an American ghost story writer, I suppose, who's passed away now. So he's one of the dead ones. I've done a couple of Russell Kirk stories, actually. He did this story called Behind the Stumps, which you can listen to. And it's set in backwoods New England. In the USA, I think, backwoods New England is a kind of a rural wilderness. You know, when we talk about the Europeans, they did stories like Dracula and Frankenstein, and they were written by, well, Stoker was Irish and Mary Shelley was English. Le Fanu was Irish as well, but they set them in obscure places. So Frankenstein's set in Germany, Stoker's is set in Transylvania, in Romania, and Le Fanu's Carmilla is set in Styria. So they're exotic, wild places in the backwoods, rural, hard to get to, poor communications. Well, of course, I think that New England, and I'm talking out of turn because I don't really know, New England serves a similar function. And I think it has to have an old culture as well. So it has to have been there long enough for people to have developed their own strange country ways with their own strange accents and their own strange rural beliefs. And of course, New England, you have all the witch cults. And of course, Lovecraft uses New England as well, from New England. I'm not sure what Russell Kirk thought of Lovecraft. Probably politically, they were relatively similar, but both being quite conservative. But in terms of sophistication and literary aspirations, I suppose Russell Kirk had aspirations of being a writerly writer, if you know what I mean, whereas Lovecraft, I don't think did. Well, who knows what he did, but certainly he isn't taken. He's a pulp writer, isn't he? So, but anyway, they use New England, and in fact, Edith Wharton, in another story we've done, Bewitched, uses rural New England. So three very different writers, but they are using the backwoods of New England in a way that the backwoods of Kent are used in this story. So you have, for a folk horror story, you have to have a backward area where old beliefs and practices linger. And you find that in all of these stories I've just talked about. There was a film came out last year, Midsummer, set in Sweden. Similar thing. The backwoods of Sweden, very rural community with strange beliefs. Folk horror, I think the phrase was invented by Mark Gatiss, who is a writer, actor, famous, and has done a lot of BBC ghost stories, brought back the ghost story for Christmas on BBC, so he's an influential character. And he kind of invented this theme, and which was applied retrospectively to various 1970s horror movies when that kind of horror set in rural England this time came. So you have things like The Blood on Satan's Claw, and Witchfinder General, and of course The Wicker Man, which is set in rural Scotland, remade in rural Washington State and after Puget Sound in these islands there with Nicolas Cage, which was a hilarious remake. It was so bad, it was hilarious. But The Wicker Man itself, the original one with Edward Woodward in it, set in the islands of Scotland, is really good. And those are considered, those three, Witchfinder General, Blood on Satan's Claw, and The Wicker Man, are the trinity of folk horror stories. So those are the elements, and this, therefore, is a folk horror story. Atavistic comes to mind. There is something, and that's why it's like Russell Kirk's story, there's something monstrous, and this hinted inbreeding as well goes along with these peasant communities are not portrayed in nice lights. You know, they are backward, they are superstitious, they are ignorant, they are inbred. And both in Russell Kirk's story and in this story, the family, an unpleasant family in both cases, is harbouring a monster. Now, I talked to Sam about her inspiration for this, and we talked about how you write a story and you think it's original. It turns out you've picked it up from something you watched or read years ago, but you've forgotten about. And she said now that can happen. There's a synchronicity, she said, whereby she finds somebody else has written a very similar story at the same time, both in a sense inspired by some long forgotten piece. She used to be a civil servant, that is to say. I don't know which department she worked for, but in London. She lives in London, in Deptford, I think. And it's a pity she didn't have the audio, because she's got a great London accent in contradistinction to my non-London accent. So it would have been nice to have that interplay of voices, but there we are. Civil servant to non-British people is somebody who works for the government. I don't know, it's Inland Revenue or something? I don't know. So, which is again a strange phrase, isn't it? The Inland Revenue Service. Then she started writing, and this story, I think she said, was the first she'd ever had published, and she's had a few done since, We talked about the monster in this goes into a kind of spasm. And we talked about another influence, which is, right, years ago, there was a comic called 2000 AD. And I loved that comic when I was a teenager. And in it was this Irish warrior called Sláine. I think they called him Slain, to be fair. Based on Cuchulainn, the great Irish Ulster hero. And Cuchulainn would warp his form in the myths, and his human form would bend and buckle and change. And of course, in the comic, this Sláine, he did the same thing, and they would draw him kind of expanding like he's made of rubber in his head. And he's, yeah, you see, I hope you were impressed by that. That impression of somebody's head going all rubbery. And I wondered if that was an inspiration. Well, she knew the character, but had forgotten about it. So I think that's something about how things stick in your memory as inspirations, and you don't actually remember where you got them from. The final thing I want to say is we did the old nurse's story set in the countryside, and then we did Man-Sized in Marble set in the countryside, and we did this one set in the countryside. So the old nurse's story set in the 1890s in the English countryside, and the countryside there is these grand country houses with very rich landowners living a completely separate life from the peasants who are their servants, and they have no interest in the peasants. They just like furniture, or they do jobs for them, right? And then we have Man-Sized in Marble, which is set in the early 20th century, and then we have a rich artistic couple going down from London to take a cottage in the countryside, and they have servants as well. But they are not as remote and distant in wealth and position and social standing. And then we have this story here whereby our narrator comes down from the countryside and mixes with the locals, and they are not very distant at all. So it is almost like a survey of the interactions of town dwellers with country folk through 3 centuries in England, you know, from the lords to the artists to the B&B people, you know. So I thought that was interesting. It's like unintendedly they are a documentation of that. I'm rambling on a bit now. So everything's going well. YouTube channel now, so as I'm talking now in July 2021, the YouTube channel is just shy of, well, it's 9,100 subscribers. And the good thing is, if I get to 10,000 subscribers, I can sell you t-shirts. And I was thinking of having the t-shirt with, you tried to open the locked drawer today, didn't you? Or, everyone dies, don't they? But some come back, you know? So we could do some of that. I've got to talk about membership. If you want to support the channel if you're specifically YouTube, you can become a member of YouTube and get exclusive videos where I'm doing video readings of stories. And I've got some stories which can't actually, they're a little bit black market, these stories. And if you go on to the members only videos, you'll see why, because they're not technically in the public domain. Don't tell anybody, right? Just between me and you thousands of people. Yeah, I don't monetize them. That's the other thing. I don't put any ads on them or anything like that. So I don't make any money out of them. They're just, and I figure I get around it by they're an offering from me to you as a work of love rather than a money-making enterprise. Although, you know, you could pick holes in that, let's be fair. Yeah, otherwise, the summer goes on. It's not particularly hot, I don't think, here. The seagulls are very noisy. My house move hasn't happened yet. I don't know how solicitors can charge you hundreds of pounds and do actually nothing, really. You know, wait a week, write a letter, sit around 2-3 weeks, write another letter, get a letter, read the letter, wait a week, tell me they've got the letter. The first solicitor we had in selling the house, buying the new house, didn't do anything. For 6 weeks, just didn't do anything at all. And then we got the new, and I had to organise it from the barge. So I had to join Lancashire Libraries, get off the barge is a boat on a canal, go to Garstang, join Lancashire Libraries, print out all the documentation, then go further on the boat to Lancaster, post them from Lancaster, and then upload a load of stuff on my phone as well, like a driving license and passports and stuff like that. And then nothing happened. And then I'm like, well, you know, it's been 10 days, what's happened? So I contact them and they say, oh, we're waiting for permission from you to do ID checks. So they have to check I am who I say I am. I've already sent them my passport details and my driving license. surely it's implicit that therefore it's okay for them to do it. They don't need my explicit signature. But anyway, worst things happen at sea, apparently. And that's it, really. Yeah, so that was a rambling discourse about Back Along the Old Track by Sam Hicks. All right, hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for all the coffee, by the way. Thank you. Oh, this is my Dark Worlds mug. Look at this. I've got to get autofocus on it. Boom. Yeah, look at this Dark Worlds mug. I had this printed when I was writing it under the pen name of Galen Wolfe. I thought Galen Wolfe sounded very sci-fi. So Galen Wolfe is like in a Hollywood blockbuster. So Dark Worlds. If you haven't heard Dark Worlds, you could maybe go and listen to it. It's on YouTube. People like it. The few that listen to it. Anyway, that just gave me a bit more rambling. So this is it. I'm now finished. I'm going to switch his camera off. Bye-bye.
Everybody dies, don't they? Some come back, don't they? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so? Isn't that so?